Well, thank you, first of all, to the Canton Suisse and its Economic Development Department, to the Swiss Finance Institute, and especially to Teresa Buser, sitting down here in the front row, who was my very efficient interlocutor in arranging this talk. So I want to go straight to the point, the first point. There has been a lot of attention just in the last few years to inequality, not as a good thing driving prosperity, but as a problem. You will be familiar with some of this. Obama's statement in 2013, repeated in his State of the Union address 2014, that growing inequality and a lack of upward mobility is the defining challenge of our time. A remarkable statement given all the other defining challenges of our time. Pope Francis, inequality is the root of social evil. The World Economic Forum also identified rising inequality of income and wealth as a major global issue. There have been several IMF research papers recent research papers pointing to inequality as a problem rather than as a good thing. And of course, Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, was a publishing sensation for example, in the 1 year after it was published in 2014. In the next 12 months, it sold 1.5 million copies around the world in hardback. In British pounds, £30. So this was an expensive book. The last big publishing sensation was Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, in 1988. Amazon has a device whereby one can calculate, this is not entirely serious, when the average reader stops reading a book. And until Piketty's book, the world record for the least number of pages read by the average reader was held by Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. The average reader stopped at page 16. That record was broken by Piketty. The average reader of Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century stopped at page 12, according to this metric. But it was a sensation, but it is striking that Piketty, in this 700-page book, said almost nothing about why we should worry about inequality. He said almost nothing about the effects of inequality, whether positive or negative. So that's the question. Why is income and wealth inequality now seen as a problem, and why now rather than decades ago when inequality first began to really rise during the 1980s? And so the point is this: until now, as I just said, inequality was not seen, until recently, inequality was not seen as a problem, and there are a whole series of reasons people gave for why we should not worry about inequality. Conservatives tended to say that a person's income is a measure of their value to society. The recent New Yorker magazine carried an article by Jane Mayer called Trump's Money Man, which was about Robert Mercer, a hedge fund manager who provided a great deal of money to Donald Trump in his campaign. And Mercer is quoted there as saying, if a person's income is 1,000 times that of a school teacher, that means that their value to society is 1,000 times greater than that of the school teacher. So this was a common kind of line of argument in conservative circles. Secondly, the argument was made that a society with higher inequality has stronger incentives for innovation to work hard. And obviously there is some truth in that. And then there was the third commonly heard maxim, a rising tide lifts all boats, so that even if inequality is going up, the wealth will trickle down and people down at the bottom will benefit as well. And then center-left leaders like Blair and Clinton and so many others tended to say, we worry about poverty, we worry about making opportunities more equal, but we don't worry about making income or wealth outcomes more equal. And just as an example of that, Willem Buiter, my former colleague at LSE and now chief economist of Citigroup, said in the Financial Times, so he didn't say this over a dinner table, he published this in the Financial Times, poverty bothers me, inequality does not, I just don't care. And so on this question, why has this become an issue now? I think part of the answer is that we now have, as of the last few years, a great deal more information than we had before, information provided by people like Emmanuel Saiz and Thomas Piketty and Tony Atkinson at Oxford and Branko Milanovic and others. So we have much better data on the degree of income and wealth inequality, and we know in particular that economic growth has accrued mostly to the already rich since 2000, especially since 2008, leaving the majority of the population on stagnant or declining real incomes for the past 2 decades. And if you want to understand Brexit and Trump and so many other things, Le Pen, then I think that that is a large part of the reason for those phenomena. So what I want to do is just run over very quickly some evidence on the extent, on the trends of income and wealth inequality. This is a famous diagram. I guess many of you will know it. It shows the percentage of all income going to the top 1% in various countries from 1930 to 2014. You see here from 1930, indeed from the 1920s, what is called the Great Compression, the great fall in the percentage of income, national income going to the top 1%. Then with remarkable synchronization, round about 1980, the late 70s, all these shares of the top 1% began to go up. That's the first point, this remarkable synchronization. But the second point is that there was considerable diversity between countries. For example, Sweden and Netherlands down here, the top 1% in 2014 getting round about between 6 and 8% of national income. In the US, the top 1% getting 18%, but this is before capital gains. So if you put in capital gains, the top 1% in the US is getting much more than 18%. And just to continue this point about the diversity between these prosperous capitalist economies, if you take the ratio of the income of the average income of the top quintile and the bottom quintile, then that ratio in the US and the UK, the Anglo countries, was about 2 times higher. The top quintile was getting twice as much as the bottom quintile in the US and the UK as in the equally prosperous countries of Northwest Europe. This is another measure of income distribution. It shows the share of wages in GDP, wages as distinct from the returns on capital from 1980 to 2013. This black line is the average of the Euro 12 countries, and so that you can see that from about the early 1970s, the share of wages began to go down, 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 right down till about 2008 or so. Subsequently, the share has gone up a little bit. But the other side of this fall in the share of wages is the rising share of profits and other returns on capital. This line here is Japan. So in the 1970s, the early 80s, the share of wages in Japan was very high. This line down here is the United States. So the share of wages in US national income has always been, in this period, unusually low relative to these other countries. And this is the share of wealth, the top 1% share of wealth in Western countries from 1910 to more or less today. You see the same picture, the great compression from 1910 through to around about 1970, and then a rising share of the top 1%. Of course, these shares of the top 1% in wealth, as distinct from income, are much higher. For example, this is the US, the share of the top 1% in US wealth. This is all wealth other than primary residence, other than the home, is over 30%. And down here is Sweden, the lowest of these countries, Sweden at about 20%, with the European average round about here, say roughly 25%. So, oh yes, and this is the last indicator. This is really dramatic. This is billionaires' global wealth share from 1987 to 2014. You can see that it's going up exponentially. This is in dollars, real dollars, adjusted for inflation. This is the crash of 2008, but you can see how very fast is the recovery of billionaires' wealth. And just three really striking facts about how the share of wealth has exploded after 2008, the share of the wealth going to the top. In the US, the share of the richest 1% in total, this is income growth now, in this period since the crisis, over 90%. So over 90% of total US income growth went just to the richest top percent, and that's excluding capital gains. At the global level, the average wealth of high net worth individuals was at least 30% higher in real terms in 2013 than it was in 2007. And again, this astonishing figure for billionaires. The net wealth of billionaires was 85% higher in 2014 than it was in 2007. So billionaires and indeed high net worth individuals more generally have done extremely well in the last few years since the crisis. But then this still raises the question, so what? Why should we care about this? Why are we hurt if Mark Zuckerberg develops Facebook and gets rich? That was Willem Buiter's answer to my question. This was over a dinner table. I said, did you really mean what you said in the Financial Times? And he said, yes, why should I worry if actually he said David Beckham earns £200,000 per week. How does that hurt me? And of course, you can't answer this question, why should we care, at that level of individuals. You have to go to the aggregate effects. The aggregate effects are pretty difficult to estimate, but I'm going to talk about the costs of higher inequality rather than the benefits, and give you a number of pieces of evidence about different types of costs of the present level of high and, in many countries, still rising levels of inequality. And I'm meaning especially, but not only, concentration of income and wealth at the top. So one argument then is that higher net inequality, that's after taxes and transfers, net inequality is associated with slower and less durable growth. And surprisingly enough, this is the conclusion reached by some researchers at the IMF, which is not known as a wild-eyed, radical, left-wing organization. But Jonathan Ostry and his colleagues, using a new data set, come up with two striking conclusions. One is that countries with higher net inequality tend to have slower and more volatile growth. And secondly, and this is really striking, this conclusion, redistribution to make income inequality more equal appears generally benign in terms of its impact on growth. So in other words, there's not, as conservatives have always said, a trade-off between inequality and growth. You can have if you try and reduce inequality, you reduce growth. And that turns out not to be the case. And Martin Wolf in the Financial Times describes these findings as strikingly clear. So that's the effect of higher levels of inequality on economic growth. And the next point, closely related but distinct, is that higher income inequality causes higher financial fragility because demand depends on debt. And the core proposition here is that high and rising income inequality generates a problem of demand, that is, demand falling below potential supply, because people who are getting the income up at the top are not spending in a way that people lower down are spending. The people at the top are spending on assets rather than on consumption goods. And so there's a tendency of high and rising income inequality to be associated with slow growth. And if you stand back and look at the whole period from 1980 to before the crisis, you can see that this tendency of rising income inequality to generate stagnation was offset by two different types of growth models, complementary growth models, but two different types. The first one was what we could call the debt-led growth model, and in the core countries, this was practiced by the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and in the periphery, this same debt-led growth model was followed in Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, the so-called GIPS, also Turkey, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and so on. The second model, which was used to offset this tendency for high and rising income inequality to generate stagnation, is the export-led growth model, exemplified in the core countries by Germany, by Austria, the Nordics, Japan, South Korea, in the periphery by China, Russia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Argentina. China is a very interesting case right now because China seems to be transitioning from the export-led growth model to the debt-led growth model, is building up a huge financial fragility, instability in its domestic financial system because of the rise of credit. And in the Financial Times just yesterday, Martin Wolf has a column called "Chinese Finance is Storing Up Trouble," in which he argues that it's very probable that there will be a serious financial crisis in China, number one, and number two, that if this happens, this may well have global implications, and we may find ourselves in something like a repeat of 2008, but this time the center will not be the United States, the center will be China. So these are two complementary models which are a response to this general tendency of rising income inequality to generate stagnation. They're complementary models, but they both rely on debt, either household debt in the debt-led models or foreign debt in the case of the export-led models. And hence, both of them, because they both rely on debt, both of them are fragile. And then if you look not so much at income, but at wealth concentration, then there's a complementary relationship to what I've just been talking about with the growth models, because wealthy people demand financial investment products. And for example, they invest in hedge funds. Hedge funds develop new financial instruments. These new financial instruments allow people lower down the income and wealth distribution to borrow, to go into debt in order to sustain their consumption in the face of stagnant incomes. And so basically the basic point here is that this concentration of wealth at the top generates these new financial products which allow people lower down to borrow in order to sustain their consumption out of stagnant incomes. So the concentration of wealth has the role of financing the debt-led growth model that I was describing in the previous slides. So this is the summary of what I've said. One, about rising inequality generating slower and more volatile growth. Two, closely related but distinct, we have these two growth models to respond to the tendency of inequality to generate demand stagnation. And both of these growth models, at the core and in the periphery of the world economy, both of them are unstable. I want to go on into probably less familiar territory to many of you and talk about the link between high inequality and a variety of social and health problems. And the basic point is this, that if you take the OECD countries, the ones with higher income inequality have a higher frequency of a range of social and health problems that correlate with social status. Not all social and health problems correlate with social status or class. For example, breast and colon cancer do not correlate with income or class, but on the other hand, heart disease does correlate strongly with income or social class. So if you take those that do correlate with social class, then there's a strong correlation between higher levels of income inequality and higher frequencies of those kinds of social and economic, social and health problems. That's in terms of average frequencies across countries. But the other striking point to note is that this is not just a matter of higher average frequency, it's also a matter of higher frequency of these health and social problems, even in the top status, which is to say that in countries with higher levels of income inequality, even the wealthy have higher exposure to these social and health problems. So in that sense, you can think of any income inequality as analogous to air pollution, which even the rich are, their life is made less pleasant by. So I'm going to refer to evidence which is pulled together, at least some of this evidence is pulled together in this book by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level. And what they do is they formulate an index of a range of social and health problems, for example, life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, and so on. And then they score the OECD countries in terms of each of these indicators, and they calculate an average for the indicator for each country. And so you might expect that the indicator would correlate closely with national income, such that poorer countries have a higher frequency of these social and health problems than do richer OECD countries. Well, just look at that scatter diagram. There's not a strong correlation. This is the correlation between a measure of income inequality here. The correlation you can see is much clearer. This is the US with a high level of social and health problems up here, a high level of inequality down here, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and so on. So this is, it's a crude kind of evidence, but nevertheless it's quite striking. You can look at it more specifically in terms of, for example, depression. The incidence of mental depression, this is in terms of US states rather than OECD countries. And you can see another measure of income inequality, the Gini coefficient, and this is the score in terms of the frequency of depression. This is not Wilkinson and Pickett's evidence, this is from a highly regarded psychiatric journal, but you can see that there's a reasonably clear correlation between inequality. Higher states with higher inequality have higher rates of depression than states with lower levels of inequality. This is another component of the Wilkinson and Pickett Index. It's participation in local groups and voluntary organizations, and it is lower in the more unequal societies. Again, a measure of income inequality. This is high inequality, and this is a measure of civic participation. So you can see that the higher the level of inequality, the lower the level of civic participation in these various countries, and this correlates closely with measures of trust. Trust is lower in interpersonal trust and trust in institutions is lower than in the higher inequality countries. And this is a point which I really do want to emphasize. I think it's a rather unfamiliar point. And the basic proposition is this, that when economic growth is moderate rather than fast, so when economic growth is like we've had since 2007, for example, and inequality is high, then the majority of the population experiences no rise in its living conditions because most of the increased income is going to people at the top. And here we get not a rising tide lifts all boats, but a rising tide lifts the yachts and does not lift the rowing boats. So when you have this combination of moderate economic growth and high inequality, then you have widely diffused in the population economically self-protective impulses. And these economically self-protected impulses easily give rise to racial and religious discrimination, antipathy towards migrants, lack of generosity towards the poor, and to Brexit, to Trumpism, not to forget Hitler, Vichy, Lenin, and Stalin. All this kind of thing follows from this type of combination, one could argue. I want to go on to the effects, the political effects, and begin with this point. I'm almost coming to the end. This is a remarkable quote from Justice Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice in the US, who said, "We must make a choice. We may have a democracy, we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, we can't have both." And the following slide I'm going to show you is one of the most astonishing slides you can see in this whole field. This is it. It shows income concentration. This is a version of the chart that I showed right at the beginning. This is the Great Compression and then the Great Dispersion, or the reconcentration here, but it only goes up to 1998. And so this again is about the 1970s here, when it begins to turn rapidly up. But this is the really striking thing. This is an index of political polarization in the House of Representatives between Democrats and Republicans. I won't stop now to explain how this index of polarization is polarization or non-cooperation between Republicans and Democrats is achieved. The point I want to draw your attention to, it's very clear in this diagram, is the remarkably high correlation between the share of income going to the top 1% and the degree of political polarization in the US politics more generally. To get this kind of coefficient, this high-valued correlation coefficient across such a long period of time is a very striking finding. Of course, that leaves open what is the mechanism of this high degree of correlation, but it helps to understand what is going on in the US and I would say also in Britain at the moment, this correlation between high levels of inequality and political non-cooperation across parties. So let me just sum up some conclusions. First of all, there are powerful forces making for rising within-country inequality all across the world, and I'll particularly highlight here this one, robots and artificial intelligence replacing vast numbers of jobs. This is one of the great global issues facing our time. And then I've said, yes, there are these powerful forces, and yes, this is a kind of net problem. There are some benefits from a certain level of inequality for sure, but my point is that the present high and rising inequality in many of the OECD countries does constitute a net problem for the various reasons that I have given. The third point I want to make is that both conservatives and the center-left are wrong to equate tackling poverty with tackling inequality. So often you hear, Tony Blair used to do this all the time. He said, yes, we're concerned about inequality, and then he would go straight on to how the Labour government was trying to reduce poverty, as though they were one and the same. They're not one and the same. Fourthly, it's clearly possible for capitalist economies to generate high prosperity with much lower levels of inequality of wealth and income than in the US, the UK, and Australia, the Anglo countries. And as I mentioned, the IMF papers are striking in this context. Again, from the IMF papers, measures to reduce inequality via taxes and transfers need not cause economic growth. And this, just to remind you of this important and neglected point, that the combination of rising inequality and modest rather than fast growth, this combination is very dangerous. And this is the situation that we're living in right now. So what to do? I've just run over a few points. How many minutes do I have? 1 minute. Okay, okay, all right. Golly. Okay, so just quickly, if you accept that inequality at the current levels is a problem, then what we should be doing is assessing all policies by the effects on inequality, not just poverty. For example, quantitative easing. Quantitative easing has been described as an inequality machine. It has been terrifically good for the people who are already rich, the people who already own assets. The second thing, we need to move towards a global register of financial wealth as a platform for bringing more wealth into the tax net. And here I refer to this book by Gabriel Zucman. It's called The Hidden Wealth of Nations. It's a very short book. Zucman was a student of Thomas Piketty, and basically he sets out in this first of all, to measure the extent of wealth hidden in tax havens, and secondly, to propose how to create a register of the owners of all the financial wealth in the world as a basis for going on to bring this wealth into the tax net. And I will have to skip this. And thirdly and finally, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but the basic point I want to make is that at the moment, the returns to capital income go to a very small proportion of the population. A very small proportion of the population gets to earn income while it sleeps. Earn income while it sleeps. And especially in response to robots, artificial intelligence, the effect of all that on jobs, we need to think of how to greatly expand ownership claims to the returns on capital, so that, for example, a very wide range of the population has ownership of shares and bonds and the like, rather than at present a very small proportion of the population, so that a large proportion, rather than a small proportion of the population, can get income while they sleep. They don't have to go to work in particular, because for so many people there won't be much regular work available. And in this slide, and this slide will, I mean, the whole thing will be available to you afterwards, I set out it very schematically an institutional device in the form of a trust, which might allow a much wider ownership of the income accruing from capital as distinct from labor. So my bottom line is that even asset managers should worry about the current level of income and wealth inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have all now realized that income inequality and wealth inequality is a problem. But one thing I would really like to ask you, because you haven't mentioned it yet, we are living in a digital revolution, and doesn't make this revolution things worse, because the well-educated, the talented, the top people get even more, and the low-level work is sort of disappearing. When you think about drivers, and now we are talking about the self-driven cars and self-driven vans, so isn't the danger there that the whole thing is getting even worse?
Yes, and that's the point. I often stand on a London street and just look at the vehicles going past, and I'm always shocked by the number of people, mainly men, but not only men, who clearly are making their living by driving people and goods from one place to another. And if this technology of driverless cars really does come on, then these people are going to be in a very precarious position. And there are lots and lots and lots of them. So what I think has to happen is we have to register this kind of evidence about the costs of inequality. And then we as members of a civic society can just keep pressing politicians, but also economists, who've tended to neglect inequality to a quite scandalous degree until very recently, to give really serious thought, both at sort of a national level, but also at international level, in organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and many others, to measures for somewhat detaching income from labor, income from work.
So this would be the unconditional basic income, for example. And this is a proposal which comes out of the Silicon Valley from some very rich billionaires who are also proposing that. So this would be an indication that they really think what kind of a problem we have here.
Yes.
So not only leftist politicians like in
exactly.
France.
And you may know Milton Friedman proposed a minimum basic income. He sanctioned that idea, but the catch was that he said that all welfare benefits should be withdrawn, and we should rely only on a minimum basic income.
We had a referendum about that in Switzerland.
Indeed.
Yes. Most of the people were not in favor of it.
Yeah, but an idea like that it should clearly be on the agenda for discussion, but also separately from that, the idea that I just touched on at the end, making the returns on capital available to a much wider share of the population, making share ownership much more widely distributed. And the question is, what institutional innovations can one think of that might facilitate organizations, trust funds like Fidelity, like Vanguard, having a much larger share of the population as their members, so that these people would also get returns on dividends, for example.
Yeah. One last question, because you are a political economist. We live in democracies. It would be possible to change the whole thing. It would be possible to change the tax system, for example, to tax the rich much more. Why do people in democracies vote for the rich people? Because in the new Trump administration, there are only millionaires and billionaires on very important jobs. So why don't they vote for their own interests?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the $64,000 question, and I'm certainly puzzled by it. But I think part of the answer is that many middle-class people, especially lower middle-class people, who see themselves as only just managing, to use Theresa May's phrase, are very, very upset at the idea that the state is redistributing downwards, that is giving social benefits to people who are poorer than them, who they see as sitting at home all day and not going out to work. And they feel this is a more active source of anger for them than reading about how or seeing in the Daily Mail about how some billionaire is spending his life in Cyprus. That seems in another world entirely, but the thought that down the street there are people on benefits who don't have to go out to work while they are going out to work, that is a strong sort of impulse for them to vote for conservative parties whose agenda may actually be, and this is the case with Theresa May's policies, lowering the tax on the wealthy.
Okay, thank you very much for your keynote. I think it's very interesting, and you can find all the facts. You can distribute it then to you, all the facts. I think it was very good to have you here and to talk about that. Thank you very much.